Good morning and welcome to topic 5 of your economics course. This topic is on the balance of payments and the exchange rate. As usual, the second slide in this part of the course lists the key issues and the hyperlinks for movement between the course. Apart from the textbook readings of parking, these are additional readings which you also found in the course outline. And this slide shows us where we are in the course. We have introduced the concept of the circular flow shown as the green arrows in this diagram. We have households and we have firms. We've also introduced the product market. We've introduced the factor market, and we're using the labor market as a proxy for the factor market. And in the last topic in this course, we looked at financial markets. This morning, we introduce the foreign sector. The foreign sector deals in two types of money. It deals in money that relates to international trade, imports and exports on the one hand, and it deals in foreign capital flows or international capital flows. The way that we measure this money coming into a country and the money going out of the country is through what is called the balance of payments accounts, and that is the next slide. And inside of the balance of payments accounts, there are two accounts that are important for our purposes. There's a current account and the financial account, and there is a third account called the reserves account, which we'll discuss in due course. As you know, I'm challenged in these PowerPoint recordings that PowerPoint doesn't allow me to use hyperlinks. So what we did in lectures was to use the hyperlink between the current account slide and this slide, ditto with the financial account. I can't do it in this recording. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to preempt these slides on the particular accounts and just talk in the context of the diagram about the current account and the financial account and the balance of payments. And we will in due course then just open up the slides, and they will effectively just record, say in writing, what I've said verbally. So the balance of payments accounts measures how much money comes into a country and how much money goes out of the country. Inside of the balance of payments accounts, there are three separate accounts. The first account is called the current account, and the current account measures how much money comes into a country as a result of exports and how much money goes out of the country as a result of imports. The second account in the balance of payments is called the financial account, and the financial account measures how much foreign capital or international comes into the country, and clearly how much foreign capital goes out of the country. And just to note that the direction of the arrow of these foreign capital flows into the country, these capital flows can go to financial markets, but they can just as well go directly to firms. They can, to a more limited extent, go to households, and they can also go to government. So please recognize that this is an arrow of convenience. We then move on to the balance of payments accounts and what these are. But if I may, before we open up the next slide, the balance of payments accounts is a very simple concept. All that the balance of payments accounts does is it measures how much money comes into the country and how much money goes out. That's all. Inside of the balance of payments accounts, there are three separate accounts. The first of these accounts is the current account. And to repeat what I said, the current account measures how much money comes in and goes out as a result of foreign trade. There are two sub-accounts in the current account. The first one is called the trade account, and the trade account measures imports and exports of goods. So oil, as you can see, oil, food, electronics, wine, etc., goes through the trade account. And the second account in the balance of payments is the services account, and clearly what that is measuring, it's measuring the imports and exports of services, tourism, financial services, transport services, etc. The second account in the balance of payments is called the financial account, and to repeat, it measures how much capital, in this case money, moves between countries. And we've spoken about this very generally. I think at this point it's useful to define it more carefully. And there are 5 different types of financial capital flows. The first kind of financial capital flow is called a foreign direct investment, or an FDI, and that is your bricks and mortar investment. For example, this is where Tata India bought Land Rover in the UK, that was a foreign direct investment. It's a bricks and mortar investment, and in many cases it's the most desirable of your investments because it is a stable investment. It often results in technological changes and things of that nature. The second kind of foreign capital flows we have between countries is called foreign portfolio investment, or FPIs. By and large, these are the ones that we've spoken about in so far in this course, because these are often speculative capital flows. This is money that goes into the bond market, or it's money that goes into the share market. So it's often speculative flows, and the money that moves between countries for FPI purposes is often called the carry trade. The carry trade, where money is being carried between countries, and very often it's the result of either interest rate differentials or expectations of future interest rate differentials. The third kind of money that moves between countries are commercial loans. For example, ABN AMRO in the Netherlands were to lend money to Greece, which would be a really good investment to do. The fourth of them are concessionary loans, or subsidized loans, or cheap loans. The word concessionary, from the World Bank for developmental projects. The World Bank would fund hydroelectric schemes. It will fund agricultural schemes. It will fund roads and railways and things of that nature. And for that, it gives concessionary loans. And the final component of the financial account are concessionary loans from the International Monetary Fund. And the purpose of that is to attempt to address macroeconomic crises. The third of the accounts in the balance of payments is called the changes in reserves account. Please note that it's not the reserves account itself that's part of the balance of payments. It's the changes in reserves. And what that is doing, it is money which has been taken out of the reserves account or put back into the reserves account. So it's those changes in the reserves account. Very often the purpose of changes in reserves is to influence the exchange rate. For more of that later. And it typically is important for countries who either try and manage their exchange rate, and very few of these exist anymore, or countries that attempt to run fixed exchange rates. We have now completed the definitional differences, a distinction between the different accounts in the balance of payments, and what we move on to now is the importance of the balance of payments. And the balance of payments is important, first of all, because it has a direct influence on standards of living. It influences long-term trade policy. And finally, it is the link between countries that save and countries that borrow. You'll recall that we've spoken about this at length in other topics in this course, but we've spoken about the difference between countries that save and countries that borrow. We've spoken about the importance of savings and borrowing. We've spoken about what happens if countries borrow from other countries and there are changes in expectations, there are changes in confidence. What we haven't spoken about is the linkage between those, and the linkage is through the balance of payments. Before we talk about the importance of the balance of payments, there is some merit in just having a look at some definitional distinctions within the balance of payments. So what we have in this particular case, this is the balance of payments of a country. And what you're seeing here, this is the current account, as you can see by the blue line. The financial account is being shown by the red line. And what we have, just to get the terminology correct, is we have a current account deficit. In other words, money's leaving the country as a result of the current account. And a current account deficit where imports are bigger than exports. More money leaves the country because of imports than comes in because of exports. The reverse of that is a current account surplus, and that is where more money is coming into the country through the current account than is leaving the country, and quite obviously that is where exports exceed imports. From the financial account perspective, here we have a financial account surplus. Clearly that is where more foreign capital flows are coming in than leaving the country. And obviously the counter side of that is a financial account deficit. Financial account deficit where more money leaves through into these international or foreign capital flows than comes into the country. Those are the definitional differences. The importance of the balance of payments accounts and its impact on standards of living If we start again with that balance of payments deficit we had a moment ago. So here we have a balance of payments deficit where there's more money leaving the country than comes in as a result of exports. And we ask the question, is that good or bad for standards of living? We debated this at length in the lectures, and the conclusion that we draw at this stage of our conversation is that this is good for standards of living. And it's good for standards of living because it means that not only can you consume the goods that you're producing in your country, you can also consume more than that because you're consuming imports. That's good for standards of living. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good from a policy perspective, but it's certainly good for standards of living. The challenge you've got, of course, is how do you pay for it? Because if you are going to run a current account deficit, you have to pay for your deficit, you have to pay for the money that's leaving the country, you have to pay for your excess imports with foreign exchange. And in the context of this diagram, the only place that you can get foreign exchange from is from the financial account. So if you don't get foreign exchange coming in through the financial account, that foreign exchange cannot leave through the current account. If you don't have foreign exchange, you can't buy imports. You'll see immediately with this conclusion how the balance of payments are by and large how the two accounts in the balance of payments are by and large mirror images of each other. So you can see here you're running a current account deficit and a financial account surplus. It's this financial account surplus which is generating the foreign exchange that you need to pay for the current account deficit. And again, you can see it very clearly in this case here, big current account deficit and of course a big financial account surplus to pay for that current account deficit. These accounts are not perfect mirror images of each other because of the reserves account. So you can intervene, you can take reserves out, you can bring reserves in. If there was no reserves account, or if countries did not intervene by using the reserves account, the two accounts, the financial account and the current account, would have to be perfect mirror images of each other. Unless you've got the foreign exchange which is coming in through one account, it can't go out through the other account. We've spoken so far about the impact of the balance of payments on standards of living and the way this conversation is going. And please note, it's only at this stage of the conversation that we are drawing these conclusions. It'll change in a moment. At this stage of the conversation, what you've got is you've got a current account deficit. The current account deficit pays for imports. Imports means the standards of living are higher than they would otherwise be. You'll notice that this particular country, which happens to be South Africa, runs by and large a sustained current account over this entire period. There's one point here where the laser pointer is, as you can see, where we now have a financial account deficit. This is the consequence of a political shock. And what one has to do here is, in order for capital to leave the country, in other words, for foreign exchange to leave the country, foreign exchange cannot leave the country unless it comes in through the current account, because you can't take money out unless the money comes in. So if a country has a shock of some sort, and if money leaves the country as a consequence of that shock through the financial account, the only place the country can generate that money is through the current account. And the question is that good or bad for standards of living? Well, if you go back to this position here, just before this political shock, you'll notice this country is running a current account deficit, financial account surplus coming in to pay for that. And given that there's a political shock and the financial account goes into deficit, the authorities in this country have to take the current account, change it from a deficit into a surplus, and they have to do that rapidly. This means you can change either imports or you can change exports. The only thing that you can change rapidly are imports. It's difficult to change exports rapidly because you've got to find the market, you've got to get into the market, you've got to get your goods to the market, etc., etc. So that is a slow change. The only option you have in the short term is to change imports. So if you're going to change imports, what you have to do is you have to stop people buying imports. And there are many different ways of doing this, but the most obvious way of doing it is to increase interest rates in today's world. If you increase interest rates, it means that the cost of people's debt, their mortgage bonds, for example, go up. They have less money to spend. The second thing that you may choose to do is to impose import tariffs, so you make imports more expensive. The third thing that may occur naturally is that the currency loses value, it depreciates. And then finally, if people are still buying more imports, you increase income taxes. Reflect on those four measures and reflect on what they will do to standards of living. Interest rates go up, import duties go up, your currency is worth less, and you're paying more income taxes. Quite clearly, standards of living decline. So the conclusion one must draw from this is that the standards of living, I beg pardon, that the balance of payments is critical to the standard of living. That if you've got a current account deficit, it means you import more than you export, and standards of living are higher than they would otherwise be in the context of this type of country. On the other hand, if you have a financial account deficit as a result of some kind of shock, the only way you can fund that financial account deficit is through a current account surplus, and that clearly is highly detrimental to people's standards of living. The overall conclusion that one draws for a country of this nature is that this is a savings-dependent country. This is the linkage between the balance of payments and savings and borrowing with other countries. Because what is happening here is effectively your financial account surplus means that other countries are lending you money. So other countries in this case were lending South Africa money. So it could come through as an FDI or an FPI or as a loan. It doesn't matter. In many senses, it's the world in some form or other where you have net savers are using their savings to lend the savings to this particular country. What is the country doing? It's using those savings to buy imports. So the country is living beyond its means. It's consuming more than it produces, and in order to do that, it's using the savings of other countries. If I can just rewind the slide back to this situation here where we're talking about a current account deficit and how do you pay for it? Some people may have been thinking, well, the easiest way to pay for it is to simply buy the currency. And that clearly it's a correct conclusion, but it's an incorrect conclusion in the context of this particular diagram. The next slide will show you what occurs when you purchase currency, and the conclusion from the next slide, again, it's a hyperlink problem. The conclusion from the next slide is that if you buy currency, your current account deficit will very rapidly turn into a current account surplus. As you can see that with this exception, this country here has run a current account deficit over this entire period, and this slide is particularly chosen because this is a very long period of time. So yes, you can buy currency, and currency can be used to pay for the current account deficit. But the consequence of following this particular approach is that your current account deficit will turn into a current account surplus very rapidly. That's what the next slide illustrates, but it really is just to answer the questions of people who may have thought, well, I can pay for my current account deficit through the purchase of currency. So to illustrate this, and as you can see, the slide's only here if it was needed, we start off as we did in the previous diagram where imports exceed exports. To be able to fund that, I need to purchase foreign exchange. If I purchase foreign exchange, the thing that's impacted on is the exchange rate, and the exchange rate needs to be understood that the exchange rate is a certain amount of domestic currency is equal to 1 unit of foreign currency. In the case, for instance, of the UK, it's a certain amount of pounds that are required to buy $1. In the case of the euro, it's a certain amount of euros that's required to buy $1. As a result, where a currency depreciates, it means that the value E becomes bigger. In other words, I need more pounds to buy $1, or I need more euros to buy $1. So where we purchase foreign exchange, the consequence of a foreign exchange is that the currency loses value and E becomes bigger. In other words, I need more euros to buy the dollar. The more euros is the E becoming bigger. So with the currency depreciation, if one looks at what happens to imports, well, with the currency depreciation, obviously imports cost more, and the consequence is that we buy less imports. If one considers what happens to the price of exports, well, exports, at least in this part of the course, the price of exports will decline because the currency lost value. As a result, because exports are cheaper in foreign currency terms, people buy more exports. And the consequence of this is it very rapidly takes what was a current account deficit and turns it into a current account surplus. There's nothing wrong with the logic in this slide. The reason for showing the slide is to show you in the previous slide that this is not what occurred. If this had occurred in the previous slide, the current account deficit would very rapidly have become a current account surplus. That didn't happen. This isn't the process, although the logic in the slide is correct. The previous slide showed a country which is savings dependent, a country like South Africa, which relies on the savings of other countries. Now we have a slightly different version on the same theme. As you can see, this is France. And where we want to focus on in the beginning of this conversation is to focus on this part of the balance of payments in France. And you can see that what we've got here is we have a current account surplus and we've got a financial account deficit. Now, in the case of South Africa, we said that this is bad because it means that you've got foreign capital outflows, foreigners are taking the money out the country, and the only way that you can pay for that is to run a current account surplus in order to generate the foreign exchange so that it can be taken out the country. This case is different because what we have here is that the French at the time were net exporters. The French make very good wine, they make very good food, they make very good clothing, etc., etc., etc. And as a result, this current account surplus that you're seeing in the diagram here, that is because the French make good stuff and they are effectively a net exporter. This financial account outflow that you see here, this is not people taking their money, this is not international people taking their money out of France. Rather, it is the French investing in other countries. And what that means is the French at that particular period were net savers. Because what they're doing is they're generating a current account surplus. They are exporting more than they're importing, which is a way of saving. And they're then using those savings to make investments, or if you like, loans into other countries. From a policy perspective, for a country, this is the best position to be in. Because if you're in this position here, then it's very difficult for foreigners to take their money out of the country, because in effect, France is a net investor. So if anything were to happen internationally, the French could remit their investments home from countries who are net borrowers. So this, from a policy perspective, is the best position to be in. You will appreciate, of course, that only half the countries in the world can be in this position, because where one country has a balance of payments surplus, of course, the mirror image of that in other countries is, of course, those countries have balance of payments deficits. So sadly, although this is, from a policy point of view, is desirable, it cannot be achieved by every country. It can only be achieved by half the countries in the world. Then, in the early 2000s, there were various policies introduced into France. There were various changes that occurred into France, and those are not important in this conversation. But what is important in this conversation is that the French current account surplus turned into a current account deficit. In other words, the French became net borrowers. And the only way the French could finance this current account deficit here was to borrow money outside of the country, and they became net borrowers. Which now puts the French at the mercy of international capital markets. Because if there are political shocks in France, then these foreign capital inflows could become foreign capital outflows. The current account would have to become a surplus, as we saw in South Africa, with all the concomitant impacts on standards of living. I wish now to turn internationally to what is best described as one of the big potential financial shocks in the world, and that is the US balance of payments. Now you'll notice when we look at this particular diagram here that the US has a current account deficit, and the US has had a current account deficit as far back as this diagram goes. Clearly, and now we begin to see it, the only way the US can fund this current account deficit is to have a financial account surplus, and it has this ongoing financial account surplus. This is highly problematic because the source of the funding for this financial account surplus is effectively from Asia. So what we have over here is we have Asia, and in brackets please read China. There's a little bit of Indonesia, a little bit of Malaysia, but it's predominantly China. And what is happening is that the States is buying imports into the States, dollars leave the country, China buys up various kinds of financial securities from the States like treasury bills, and the dollars come back into the country. Then they leave the country, China buys more financial securities from the States, and the money comes back into the country. And all the time while this is occurring, China holds more and more and more of US financial assets. This diagram brings the previous diagram up to date, where the previous diagram, it has become increasingly more difficult to get data in that format. So what you're seeing here is just the current account deficit in the States. It doesn't matter because we know now that to fund a current account deficit, you need a financial account surplus. So we're just seeing the one side of it, but that's cool. And this is the most recent information that we have. And one of the things which is noteworthy in this diagram is, apart from the fact that the US has a current account deficit, is how the deficit has been shrinking all the way up to the current time. This is noteworthy, and within the context of the US wishing to reduce its trade imbalance with China, and as you said before in this course, the only way that that's ever going to happen is not through tariffs, but is only if America begins to save more, because that will give America then a current account surplus and a financial account deficit. But the fact is that the current account is shrinking, and the current is shrinking, and the mirror image of it, of course, is what's happening in China, which is the next slide. And when you look at China, then what is happening in the States in terms of the US current account deficit is being reflected in the Chinese current account surplus. And you'll see that sort of 2009, 2008, how the Chinese current account surplus peaks, and we then have this ongoing decline in the Chinese current account surplus. Now, I think it's obviously important to realize that it's not just China and the US. It's obviously the US has a current account deficit with the world, and China has a current account surplus with the world. But the fact that they are both converging close to a balance line in the separate countries and not in any way in causation is noteworthy. The other thing that's noteworthy in this diagram is just how the Chinese current account surplus has been shrinking, and as you can see in this diagram, is now less than 2% and declining. And that's important. And that's important because what it says is that if this trend continues, then China, which has been a net saver for the last 2 decades in the world, could well become a net borrower. And if the Chinese current account surplus becomes a Chinese current account deficit, then China will become a net borrower in the world. There's no real time or space in this conversation to begin to explore the implications of that. We did discuss it in lectures. It's speculative, so and it's a long conversation. So in this narrated PowerPoint, I'm just going to stop that conversation there, but it's a space that needs to be watched. The following slide that comes up then really links back to 2 slides before, when we were looking at the US current account deficit and the financial account surplus, and the point that was made about who is it that holds the financial securities that sit behind the current account deficit and the financial account surplus. And that's what the following slide shows you, as is shown in this diagram. So if you look in this diagram, you can see that the biggest holders of financial assets, of the US financial assets, is Asia, re China, and these are very large numbers. These are in millions of dollars, so these are very large numbers. This has the potential for major international economic shocks. Should anything happen in China, should anything happen in the States to upset this financial relationship between these 2 countries, it has the potential for major economic shocks. One of the components of the European financial crisis was the mismatch between savings and investment, and then of course the mismatch between financial account and current account between countries in Europe. For example, the French current account deficit was in fact being funded by the German current account surplus. The Greek current account deficit was being funded by the German current account surplus. The Portuguese current account deficit was in fact being funded by the Dutch current account surplus. But the values of those mismatches in Europe are very small relative to the mismatches between the US and China. So anything that were to undermine this financial relationship between China and the US has the potential for major international economic shocks. And for you, going forward, this is one of the elements that you have to watch, because any kind of shock that results possibly in a reversal of these capital flows has the potential to cause major shocks throughout the world. The UK, and what's quite obvious is the UK runs a sustained current account deficit. It's also a very large current account deficit. We're looking in 2010, for example, around 4% of GDP. That is significantly large. We're looking in 2015, pushing 2016, of nearly 6% of GDP. This is a substantial current account deficit. And recognize, of course, that a current account deficit needs to be matched by a financial account surplus. And should there be any political pressure in Britain, you understand what I mean, and there are financial account outflows, then the current account has to adjust to those financial account outflows. So from a UK perspective, this is problematic. Japan, as you probably guessed, and as you can see in this diagram, has a current account surplus, and it is a significant current account surplus in 2008 or so, pushing nearly 5% of GDP. It drops down in 2014. It remains positive throughout the period and kind of sits around 4% of GDP, which is a significant current account surplus. Germany is an interesting one, because you'll notice in Germany that what we have here, surprisingly enough, is a current account deficit. And this is quite contrary to, in contrast to how we imagine Germany today, as Germany is this huge economic powerhouse. But this is a period where Germany was called, quote unquote, and these are not my words, the sick man of Europe. And you can see, German exports were not competitive. Imports dominated exports, and Germany runs a current account deficit. It's in this period here, just post 2000, that there's a social pact between labor and business to grow Germany. Real wages fall, Germany becomes increasingly more competitive, and you can see what happens to the current account deficit, and you can see how it becomes a current account surplus. And the numbers we're looking at with this current account surplus are really, really big numbers, which from a German perspective is great, but from a political European perspective is problematic, because one recognizes that current account surpluses in one country are current account deficits in the other. And Germany is often accused of causing current account deficits in many European countries because of its current account surplus and because of its highly competitive economy. It's an interesting debate, and I don't want to start taking sides in that debate. I think that the fact of the matter is that Germany runs a current account surplus. That's a fact. Other countries in Europe run a current account deficit. That's a fact. Whether they're going to change or not, those are political issues on the one hand, and of course it would require either that productivity in other countries in Europe were to increase or productivity in Germany were to decline for this situation to work its way through. Or there's a political solution. We've seen this particular diagram earlier on in the lectures, but and let me make the point again then, is that what you're looking at here, in the 1990s that France has got a current account surplus where it makes it a net saver, and it then has a current account deficit which makes it a net borrower. So we made that point before. But in the context of the previous diagram with what was happening in Germany, it could be argued that part of the cause of the French current account deficit is the German current account surplus. Hear my words, it could be argued. On the other hand, it could be argued that France simply has become uncompetitive, and that's the reason for the current account deficit. Again, the fact is that France runs a current account deficit, which means that it is a net borrower and therefore is at mercy to movements of financial capital around the world. Here's Russia. Russia runs a current account surplus, that's oil and gas, and from a Russian perspective that is desirable because it gives Russia a certain amount of leeway in terms of what happens within the Russian economy in the world. India, apart from one very small period over here, as you can see, runs a current account deficit, which makes India a net borrower on the world. It did start to shrink up to 2016, and as you can see, has been increasing again. Conclusion is obvious. It puts India at the mercy of world capital markets. Being a net borrower, if there are problems in India, there could well be capital outflows. The Netherlands, as you can see, is a world leader in current account surpluses, and that's putting at 10% of GDP. So it sits in a similar position to Germany, except that it never ran a current account deficit as Germany did. So what it says is that the Dutch economy is very competitive, which of course is a good thing from a Dutch perspective, but it also brings in that European political dimension that the Netherlands is, there is political pressure from Europe on the Dutch to reduce its current account surplus in order that other countries in Europe can begin to at least reduce their current account deficits. The final diagram we have in this series of diagrams, if you're at all interested, and there's always one or two people in the class who are South Africans. South Africa, as you can see, has a current account deficit. There are periods where it was a very, very large and very dangerous current account deficit, 2008 or so, and then around about 2012, 2014, it has been shrinking. South Africa, we've mentioned this many times in this course, is a net borrower, and of course it puts South Africa at the mercy of world capital flows. The final slide in this section of our discussion is just to have a look broadly at the current account deficits and surpluses across the world. This is 2015, the latest data which is available. And if you just understand the coding, that the green is a deficit, a current account deficit, the darker the green, the bigger the deficit. The brown is a surplus. The more brown you are, the bigger the surplus. That's an interesting conclusion. So if we look at this here, who are the surplus countries? Well, it's your Scandinavian countries. It's Ireland, it has no choice. It's Portugal, Spain, it has no choice. Italy have no choice. Greece have no choice. They've been forced to become net savers. Russia, at this particular point, has running a current account surplus, and so is China and a few bits and pieces around here in Asia Pacific. Who are the world's net borrowers? Well, the whole of the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, India, as we saw earlier on, and the parts of Africa where data is available, including South Africa. We conclude that the net savers in the world are up in this part of the world here. I think when we see Spain, Portugal, Italy as aberrations because they're being forced into that, the net borrowers, all these countries in green, and this is a serious mismatch in what's happening in the world. The purpose of the next few slides is simply to set the scene with some empirical and general overview discussion before we start getting into the theory of exchange rates. So the exchange rate is the mirror image of the balance of payments. In the balance of payments, what we have is we have a flow of funds. So we look through the balance of payments and you see the money moving between countries, either for trade-related purpose through the current account or because of financial capital flows for whatever reason through the financial account. The balance of payments shows the value of those capital flows. In other words, of those balance of payments flows. So in other words, money moves between countries. That's a physical movement of funds. The exchange rate shows you the value of the currency as a result of those changes. We do need to make a distinction now because we're going to do it later on in this conversation between exchange rates which are market quoted, and these are the ones that we normally talk about and the ones we're going to look at in a moment in some of the diagrams after this. But when we start talking about real exchange rate, there is a need for us to understand the meaning of effective rates. And effective rates, there's a reading there. Please go and have a look at that. What an effective rate does is it doesn't look at a dollar-euro exchange rate, for example. Rather, what it looks at a basket of currencies relative to a single currency. So, for example, if we look at the euro, we'd compare the euro not to the US dollar, but rather to the euro to the basket of currencies that are the important trading partners of the Eurozone. So, in the effective rate for the euro in the basket of currencies, we would have some dollar, we'd have some pound, we'd have some yuan, and Swiss francs, and so on. So it's a basket of currencies rather than a single currency. And one of the advantages of using an effective rate is that it gives us the best trade weighted value of a currency. So rather than looking at euro dollar, we look at the euro effective rate, which says actually this on with a mix of all the countries that the eurozone is trading with, this is the best way to judge the trade weighted value of the currency. Before we get into looking at exchange rates and the conceptualization of how exchange rates move and what happens, I just want to show you some pictures to set the scene around different kinds of exchange rates and allow us, when we get into the theoretical part of this course, to keep coming back and saying, oh, okay, so we saw this happening and this is how we explained it in conceptually, and we saw this happening and this is how we explained it in the diagrams. So this is the list of things that I want to just start off by illustrating. So I want to just say some general movements in exchange rates where there really isn't a story to be told. Some safe haven currencies. What happens if there's inflation differentials between countries? What happens when there's capital movements? Some illustration around fixed exchange rates. And then finally, and this doesn't happen right now within the section, but what will become apparent as this part of the discussion unfolds is so-called undershoots and overshoots, where an undershoot is where currency goes below its long-term value, it undershoots its long-term value and then recovers. And an overshoot is where a currency appreciates above its long-term value and then depreciates again, so it overshoots that value. So just to illustrate the points, and this is impressionistic. So in this diagram here, we're looking at the British pound to the US dollar, and we interpret the diagram as £1 is equal to a certain amount of dollars. This interpretation here changes from diagram to diagram, and it really depends upon how trading economics illustrates their data. Sometimes it's $1 is equal to, sometimes it's a currency equal to $1. So we must be careful what this means and look at the values here. But the point of this diagram, and I'm looking at the period, just this period here, this 3-year period, to say in this period, if you look at the pound-dollar exchange rate, well, there's an awful amount of noise going on here. But if we just trend it, you know, where did the currencies go against each other? Well, actually nowhere. So these are general movements. There's no story to be told. The same for the yen in this particular period that we're looking at here. Again, you can see there's ups and downs across the whole thing, but on the whole, across this whole period, there's not really any fundamental change in those two exchange rates. Then we begin to look at the dollar as a safe haven currency. So now you can see, and we're looking here at €1 is equal to a certain amount of dollars. So now the diagram has changed slightly. So what it says is that €1 bought you $1.2, $1.3, $1.4, $1.5. So the euro becomes stronger as we go that way, and the euro becomes weaker, or the dollar becomes stronger as we move in this direction. So the purpose of this slide, and to show you the dollar as a safe haven currency, if we start where the point of the slide is, if we start here, this is the period of the financial crisis, and it starts really 2007. It begins to start happening, but the kind of big moment of the financial crisis, when everybody realized just how bad the financial crisis was the Lehman Brothers collapse. And you would expect that if the dollar was a currency like any other currency, that there'd be a flight out of the dollar. Yet, as you can see with the Lehman Brothers collapse, what happens to the dollar relative to the euro is the dollar becomes stronger because the euro is becoming weaker. So €1 bought you $1.50, then it bought you 1.4, then it bought you 1.3, and was pushing the 1.2 mark. So you can see how the dollar is becoming stronger because the euro is becoming weaker. And it illustrates the point that the financial crisis in the world and in the States, even in the face of that financial crisis, actually the dollar became stronger. And what it's illustrating the safe haven nature of the dollar at that point in time. The second of the safe haven currencies is the yen. And in this case here, we're reading it as $1 is equal to a certain amount of yen. So $1 buys you 80 yen, 90 yen, 100 yen. And you can look at the safe haven value of the yen. So now, what we saw in the previous slide is we saw the dollar was a safe haven currency against the euro in the face of the financial crisis. You can see what's happening in the financial crisis of the yen relative to the dollar is that in fact the yen became a safe haven currency against the US dollar. It is of course problematic for Japan in that particular case, because of course as the yen appreciates against the dollar and all other currencies, it makes Japanese exports less competitive and works against any kind of economic stimulus happening in Japan. The third of the safe haven currency is the Swiss franc, and here we're again reading $1 equal to a certain amount of Swiss francs. Over the period of the financial crisis, where the dollar was getting stronger against the euro, it was getting weaker against the yen, or in fact the yen was a safe haven currency, and so was the Swiss franc. And you can see the Swiss franc is getting stronger here because $1 was buying you 1.2 Swiss francs, then 1.1, then 1, then 1, then 0.9, then 0.8. And we see in this period here, which is the financial crisis, how the Swiss franc was even more safe haven currency than the dollar. This slide shows you what happens when there's political shocks and capital movements. So in this one here, we're looking at £1 is equal to a certain amount of dollars. £1 buys you 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 dollars. So the pound becomes stronger in that direction and obviously weaker as we move down the vertical axis. Between 2010 and 2015, there's no real story to tell. And then, of course, we have Brexit. And you can see the political shock of Brexit and how it causes the pound a significant and very rapid depreciation in the pound because of that political decision. In Russia, we also have capital movements. This is the annexation of Crimea. And quite a lot of political pressure that was happening in Russia at the time. So you can see the capital outflows and you can see the impact on the ruble. Now we move to inflation differentials. This is where you have inflation, for example, in India, as we see in this diagram, which is higher than inflation in other countries in the world, like the States. And this long depreciation in the rupee here across this whole diagram is the consequence of those inflation differentials. I'm merely making a statement. We'll understand why that happens in due course. The same occurs in South Africa. In South Africa runs inflation which is higher than the rest of the world, inflation which is higher than the States, and you can see the impact on the value of the local currency, the rand, and the rand depreciates across that period because of these inflation differentials. We turn our attention now, just again in this illustrative part of the discussion, to fixed exchange rates. This is where countries choose to fix their exchange rate, either the dollar or the euro, or to fix them against the currency of a neighboring country or a large trading partner, for example. And this is the US and the yuan. So we're looking at China. And you can see here there's a fixed exchange rate in that period. There's obviously fixed because there's no change. You can see here there's also a fixed exchange rate, and possibly here the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, probably also fixing the exchange rate in that period there. Subsequent to that, you can see that these changes here, we don't have a fixed exchange rate in the true sense of the word. We may have some intervention on the part of the People's Bank, but it certainly is not a fixed exchange rate. Then we have Nigeria and the Naira. And again, you can see the Naira is fixed in periods here. You can see that part there. And apart from this little crisis that we're seeing here, the Naira is also fixed against the US dollar in this latter period here. The mirror image of the balance of payments are exchange rates. So on the one hand, where we see funds moving between the balance of payments, And as those funds change, obviously the balance of payments changes as well. So we see as a mirror image what happens to the price of a currency. In this part of our conversation, we need to consider at least two different approaches to exchange rate determination. There are different theories that are effectively complementary theories of explaining exchange rates. And what distinguishes these different theories is their time dimension. Over what period of time are they trying to explain exchange rate changes? The first of the approaches we're going to use is called the elasticities approach. And what that attempts to do, it attempts to explain exchange rate movements between, say, for example, about 6 months and 3 to 5 years. The second approach that we're going to have a look at is called the monetary approach, the balance of payments. It's a longer term approach, and it tries to explain exchange rate movements beyond 3 years, beyond 5 years. And the final approach to exchange rate determination, which we're not going to do in this course, is trying to explain very rapid changes in exchange rates, the kind of noise we see in the balance of payments and with exchange rates. We're not doing that. We don't have time. And it's really relates to, it's useful to traders rather than to people who want a general overview of economics. So let's start with the elasticities approach. And it's an approach that you'll find very easy to understand because it's based on demand and supply. So as we did with demand and supply of shoes, demand and supply of food, so this is demand and supply of foreign exchange. The impact of the change in the demand supply of foreign exchange clearly impacts on the exchange rate. And the impact depends on what is called the exchange rate regime. In other words, how a country chooses to manage or conduct its exchange rate. For most countries that most of us are familiar with, we have fully flexible exchange rates. So as demand and supply changes, so the exchange rate changes, and it's the easiest one to understand. The second one we have are what are called managed exchange rates, where countries intervene to make minor adjustments with their exchange rates, in some cases major adjustments, but typically minor. Then we have countries, less and less in today's world, but they still have them, that attempt to run fixed exchange rates. And finally, we have countries that try and fix their exchange rate below the actual true market value. We're going to work our way through this list, and it does go from simple to less than simple. So let's start off with a simple one. Let's use demand and supply to understand flexible exchange rates. So this diagram attempts to understand demand and supply for foreign exchange using flexible exchange rates. On the vertical axis, we have the exchange rate, so we use the lowercase e to denominate an exchange rate, which I think is fairly straightforward. What is important here is to understand how we interpret this vertical axis, and it is always read, at least for most countries in the world, as $1, $1 is equal to a certain amount of other currency. So if we do this from a UK perspective, the international convention is that $1 is equal to pounds. If we do it from a European perspective, the international convention is that $1 is equal to a certain amount of pounds. We will in due course have a look what that means for other kinds of exchange rate. They're called the cross exchange rates, but for the moment let's just stay with this diagram. The vertical axis is the exchange rate. You understand it as $1 is equal to a certain amount of domestic currency. We're going to deal with pounds. And the horizontal axis then is quantity of dollars. So even though we're going to be dealing with this approach from the perspective of the UK, the horizontal axis is quantity of dollars. As a result, there's a supply curve of dollars, a supply curve like any other supply curve, and there's a demand curve for dollars. From a UK perspective, the demand curve for dollars, the people in the UK would demand dollars to pay for imports, for example, from the States. and the states would supply dollars to the UK, where Americans buy British exports. If there are foreign capital inflows from the States into the UK, let's take a simple example. Somebody in the States buys an apartment in London. That is an inflow of dollars into the country. And where there's an outflow of foreign capital from the UK to the US, somebody an American who owns an apartment in London sells that apartment, that American is holding pounds. In order to get the pounds out of the UK, they would demand dollars. So it's important to see in this diagram that the demand for dollars and the supply of dollars contain both current account and financial account. So this is a demand for dollars from people from the UK to buy American exports on the one hand, and demand for dollars in order for capital flows to go out of the UK. This is a supply of dollars from Americans who are buying British exports on the one hand, and it's a supply of dollars from the States to the UK for capital flows. The market then clears. So it's a fully flexible exchange rate. So as these curves move around, so the value of the currency will change. It's useful now in the context of this diagram to understand that we could use any currency at all on the vertical axis. It doesn't have to be pounds, it can be euros, it can be yen, because the so-called cross exchange rates remove any potential for arbitrage between currencies. So if we start with the cross exchange rates and we start with, for example, $1 is equal to 1 euro, 1 euro is equal to 1 pound, and strangely enough, $1 is equal to 2 pounds. Now, what you have here is you have a mismatch of exchange rates, and it's a mismatch which in the real world could not exist, because it's the job of foreign currency dealers to ensure that even the smallest mismatches between cross exchange rates are arbitraged away very rapidly. But let's arbitrage this one away. So where would you start? If you wanted to make a lot of money with this cross exchange rate mismatch, where do you start? Well, you start by using your pound to buy a euro. With your euro, you'd buy $1. And with your dollar, you'd buy 2 pounds. And then you'd buy 2 euro, and then you'd buy $2, and then you'd suddenly be very wealthy. Clearly, it's not going to happen, unfortunately, because the initial source of the disturbance is here at the pound. You started with 1 pound to buy 1 euro. So the starting point is that the value of the pound will change, and it will become 2 pounds to 1 euro. And immediately that happens, the cross exchange rates are now in equilibrium. There is no arbitrage, there's no profit to be made. This was an extreme example. In the real world, obviously, you won't get such extreme examples. You'll get point of a cent or point of a pence, and those points are arbitraged away. That's what foreign currency dealers do. Very often the previous slide confuses people because you're in the UK and you don't think about $1 equal to pounds. Rather, you think about 1 pound is going to buy me a certain amount of dollars. Bear in mind again that the international convention is that $1 is equal to a certain amount of domestic currency. But in order to see this, and in order to visualize this from both perspectives and clear up any potential confusion that there may exist, let's start off with the international convention. So it's the previous diagram. So we have $1 equal to pounds. And let's just give the mirror image of that diagram, which is 1 pound is equal to dollars. So we can see both sides of the same picture. The horizontal axis in the left-hand diagram, as we had before, is quantity of dollars. The horizontal axis in the right-hand diagram is quantity of pounds. So now we have the supply of dollars. So Americans are attempting to buy exports from the UK. Let's take an example. Americans develop a taste for British beer. So they supply dollars to buy British beer. But at the British brewery, they have to pay in pounds. So therefore, there's a demand for pounds at the brewery. So we need to see these two curves as mirror image. On the one hand, you have Americans supplying dollars to buy British beer, but once those American dollars get into the UK, they have to be converted into pounds because at the UK brewery, we pay for the beer in pounds. So this supply of dollars here, the mirror image is the demand for pounds. Similarly, there's a demand for dollars. Okay, and we do the reverse one. So the UK is demanding dollars to pay for American exports, or if you like, goods coming from the States into the UK. But at the level of in the US, you have to actually use dollars. So I'm demanding dollars to pay for those exports. I'm supplying pounds in order to convert into dollars. The exchange rates then are the same. And now imagine we have a change. Imagine, for instance, that there's an increased demand for American imports in the States, and they demand more dollars to pay for those imports. And now we have a shift in the dollar demand curve to pay for goods coming from the States into the UK. How do people in the UK facilitate that process? They don't have dollars. So what they will do in turn is they will supply pounds. So now we have, again, a mirror imaging that goods are coming from the States into the UK. We need to pay for those goods with dollars, therefore we demand more dollars. But in the UK, we don't have dollars, we have pounds. So we supply pounds to the market to convert those pounds into dollars to be able to give the dollars to the States. So we're supplying pounds and demanding dollars in a simultaneous process. In this case here, the pound has become weaker. I need more pounds to buy a dollar. In this case here, the pound has become weaker. I need more pounds to buy a dollar. We're now going to use what we have to run some shocks, some exchange rate shocks through this diagram that we had before. And these are the shocks. So we're going to have the world develops a taste for British export. There's a change in the British business cycle. There's a political shock. There's inflation changes, etc., etc. We'll do these one at a time as we go through here. So let's start off with a very simple one, that the world develops a taste for British beer. So this is the first example we're going to run, which is the simplest of all the examples because there's only one change in one account. The world develops a taste for British beer. And you'll notice that what we're doing here, just so that you can see in this example both sides of the exchange rate movement, we're doing it as per the international convention. $1 is equal to a certain amount of pounds, and then £1 is equal to a certain amount of dollars. So Americans develop a taste for British beer. We need to pay for the beer in pounds. Americans don't have pounds. So what they will do is they will supply dollars. And as a result, you will get a rightward shift in the supply of dollars. And the pound will appreciate because I'm looking at $1 equal to a certain amount of pounds. So $1 was buying me an amount of E1 pounds. Now $1 buys me less pounds. In other words, the pound has appreciated. Similarly, in the UK, where Americans are supplying dollars into the UK to buy the beer, in the UK, it's very difficult to use dollars, so you need to use pounds. So as a consequence, once we get to actually purchasing the beer at a brewery, for example, we need to purchase in pounds. And the consequence here is that there is now an increased demand for pounds in order to pay the beer. So this rightward shift, the supply curve, dollars are being supplied from the States. Those dollars are converted into pounds, and simultaneously there's an increased demand for pounds. Those are simultaneous responses. In this case here, we're looking at £1 equals a certain amount of dollars. So you can see that the pound is appreciated because £1 now buys you a certain amount of dollars. Now £1 is buying you more dollars. In this case here, it's that $1 buys you a certain amount of pounds. Now $1 is buying you less than that certain amount of pounds. So E1 to E2 here is a pound appreciation. E1 here to E2 here is a pound appreciation. And that's because of these different axes. The second example we come to is an unexpected upswing in the British business cycle, and it's important in this context to limit the upswing that it is it's a consequence of what's happening in Britain. It's not a consequence of what's happening in the world economy. So something has happened in Britain to cause an upswing in the British business cycle. The first thing that's going to happen is that we're going to get capital inflows. There's going to be an upswing in the UK economy. You want to get in before the upswing starts. So the first thing that happens is going to be a capital inflow. And the capital inflow will be seen as an increased supply of foreign exchange. In this case, it'll be an increased supply of dollars. And the consequence is that the pound will appreciate from point A through to point B. Now, as the British become richer, because of the upswing in the business cycle, they'll buy more goods. Part of those goods will be imports, and because they are buying more imports, they will demand foreign exchange. The consequence is that the demand for dollars will move to the right, and the pound will now depreciate. The net overall effect in the way this particular diagram is drawn is that the pound will still appreciate. The overall change in the pound is an appreciation from E1 to E2. But what is happening here is that the pound has actually has appreciated from point A to point B, and then has depreciated from point B to point C. The net appreciation that we're seeing in this diagram is not a foregone conclusion. The overall change in the exchange rate would be dependent upon the relative amount of capital inflow compared to the relative amount of the increased demand for dollars, the increased demand for imports into the UK. And excuse me. And clearly, if the increased demand for dollars exceeds the increased supply of dollars, the net overall effect, of course, is that the pound actually would depreciate. That would be true of certain countries. It would probably be true of South Africa. It may be true of India, for instance. But in the case of the UK, it's more likely than not that an appreciation of the British business, that an upswing of the British business cycle will cause a net overall appreciation of the pound. However, it's not necessarily the case. All that we can say in this case is that an upswing in the British business cycle causes an inflow of dollars, which will cause an appreciation of the pound. It will then cause a demand for dollars through the current account, which will cause a depreciation of the pound. We don't know the net overall change in the exchange rate. In the British case, I would argue that more likely than not, it will be a net appreciation. Here we have a political shock in the UK. And a good example of the political shock would be, for instance, a Scottish civil war or Brexit. So let's go back to June 2016 when Brexit is announced, and that's a major political shock. And the consequence of that major political shock is that there's big capital outflows. A big capital outflow is seen as an increased demand for dollars. People who are in the UK sitting in pounds, they want to get their pounds out of the UK. They have to convert from pounds into dollars. They have to demand dollars. So the consequence of a Brexit change is that the pound would depreciate from A to B. This had the potential to cause the British economy to move into recession. If the British economy moves into recession, it has the effect of causing a fall in demand for goods and services on the part of the British public, including a fall in demand for imports. And because imports fall, there's a fall in demand for dollars, and the pound now appreciates from point B through to point C. So what you have here is you have a situation where there's capital outflows causing an increased demand for dollars and a depreciation from A to B. And then the British public are poorer, which in turn leads to falling demand for imports. It therefore leads to full demand for foreign exchange. The demand curve moves to the left, and the currency appreciates from point B to point C. And this results in a net overall depreciation in the pound. And that is what we saw with Brexit. One of the things that we saw when we were describing exchange rates was we looked at India and South Africa, and we saw that where those two countries run inflation differentials, their currency depreciates. The purpose of this slide is now to illustrate the mechanism by which that currency depreciates. So we start off using the example that in the UK we have inflation of 10%, in the US we have no inflation, and we ask the question, what happens to the price of UK exports to the US? Well, clearly the price of UK exports increases because they're going up by the 10%. And the consequence of that, of course, is that the demand for UK exports will decline. If UK exports decline in volume, then in America, they supply less dollars to pay for those exports, and the supply curve moves to the left. The mirror image of what's going on the UK side is what's happening with the price of US exports. So if we look at the price of US exports in pound terms, the relative price of US exports declines. If you go back to the inflation differentials, US exports coming into the UK have a price increase of 0. Similar goods in the UK have a price increase of 10%. Which means that the relative price of US exports have gone down. US export prices have a 0 change. UK export of comparative goods have a 10% price increase, and the consequence is that US exports in relative terms are cheaper. Demand for US exports obviously increases, and because the UK is now demanding more US exports, they demand more dollars to pay for those exports. And the net overall effect of that sequence of events is that the pound depreciates from point E1 to E2. It's important to appreciate that in reality, you're not going to get these stepwise changes. You're not going to get a shift in the supply curve. You're not going to get a shift in the demand and then a shift in the demand curve. Rather, what will happen is you're going to get a gradual process over time. So as the inflation differentials open up, what will happen is you'll get demand and supply changes, the pound will depreciate, you'll get further demand and supply changes, and you'll get this ongoing depreciation of the pound, which will continue until the inflation differentials stabilize. And only if the inflation differentials stabilize will the pound actually stabilize at point E2. Clearly, if the inflation differentials continue over time, so the pound will continue to depreciate over time as well. And that's what we saw with the Indian rupee and the South African rand, that those two countries continuously run inflation rates which are higher than their trading partners. And the consequence, of course, is that their currencies depreciate continuously against those of their trading partners. We turn our attention now to the distinction between homogeneous and non-homogeneous exports. Homogeneous means where an export is the same as everybody else's. So coal is homogeneous, iron ore is homogeneous, and in this case oil is homogeneous, because that's all the same no matter where it comes from, by and large. In contrast, for example, to motor cars, which are non-homogeneous. German cars are very different to French cars, are very different to Italian cars. These are non-homogeneous. So we start off with a change in the price of a British export, which is oil, and we have an increase in the price of oil. If there's an increase in the price of oil, this is caused by increases in the world prices of oil. You can't have the price of British oil just going up. It's not possible. It's got to be an increase in world prices, which results in the price of British oil going up. If the price of British oil goes up, if the price of world oil goes up, the world pays Britain more for its oil. And because the world is paying Britain more for its oil, there's an increased supply of dollars of foreign exchange coming into Britain, and the pound will appreciate. Now contrast this to a non-homogeneous export, British tourism, where British tourism is very different in nature to tourism, say, in the south of France, to tourism in India, to tourism in Africa. They're all different kinds of tourism, they're non-homogeneous. And the question is, which curve moves? Well, clearly the supply curve moves, because if you're going to the UK and you're going to stay in accommodation, you're going to eat in restaurants, you would be supplying foreign exchange. The next question, which is a more difficult question to answer, is in what direction? And that is not a question we can answer without actually knowing what the price elasticity of British tourism actually is. Is it elastic or is it inelastic? So if it's elastic, for example, and this we'll show as a movement in the supply curve, but we're going to use a red colored supply curve to illustrate that. And by the way, the numerical example of what we're going to do here is shown in the next slide. So this is a bit confusing. Look at the numbers in the next slide. So we have the British tourism is price elastic. In other words, if the price of tourism goes up by 1%, then demand drops by proportionately more than 1%. It drops, for instance, by 2%. So if the price of British tourism goes up by 1%, demand drops by 2%, it means that supply drops. And the supply curve moves to the left and the pound depreciates. On the other hand, imagine that British tourism is price inelastic. So people will go to Britain irrespective, to be extreme, of what happens to prices. So for example, if there's a price drop of 1%, then there's a very small drop in demand and it only decreases by 0.5%. Supply increases. So it's not evident what would happen to the pound if there's a change in the price of a non-homogeneous British export. If it's elastic, the pound will depreciate. If it's inelastic, the pound will appreciate. The next slide shows this numerically. So if you have a situation where the price of a hotel room is £10, there's 20 hotel rooms being rented out, the total revenue there is 200. Then the price of a hotel room goes to, say, £20 and it's price elastic. It means that there's a more than proportionate decrease in the quantity of rooms. So if you like, the number of rooms that are now rented out is only 5. It's a more than proportionate drop because you've got a doubling here, you've got a doubling in the price level, but the quantity of rooms rented out is now only a quarter of what it was before. That's a price elastic change. The revenue increases, the revenue changes, is now 100 compared to 200. Revenue declines, the supply curve moves to the left. If, on the other hand, tourism is price inelastic, so the price of hotels goes from 10 to 20, and again to 20, keep the numbers the same, but the quantity in this case is less than proportionate. So a 1% increase would be 10 rooms. A less than 1% increase is, for example, 12 rooms. So now your total revenue is 240. So you started off with a revenue of 200. You increased your price. There's a less than proportionate change in the quantity, and your revenue has actually gone up. Supply curve moves to the right. We come now to managed exchange rates. All of the previous diagrams you've used in changing exchange rates have been where exchange rates are flexible as demand and supply changes, so the value of the currency changes. In this case here, we're now going to have a situation where, we're using the UK as an example, where the Bank of England will intervene to manage its exchange rate. And for the first time, we introduced the third of the accounts on the balance of payments, which, if we recall, is the reserves account. The example that we want to use is a fairly simple example. Let's imagine that British Airways orders several large Boeing aircraft from the States. And as the Boeing aircrafts arrive and they have to pay in dollars, there's an increased demand for dollars to pay for those Boeings. If nothing was done to manage the exchange rate, this would have the consequence of causing the exchange rate to depreciate from E1 to E2. Let's imagine that the Bank of England, for whatever reason, wants to prevent that currency depreciation and would prefer to keep the currency at its original level at E1 as shown by the new dotted line. In other words, it wants to keep the exchange rate at E1 irrespective of what happens to demand and supply for foreign exchange. So what the Bank of England will need to do, it will need to go to its reserves account. It will need to draw down on dollars from its reserve account, and it will need to supply those dollars to the market, which will cause a corresponding rightward shift in the supply curve, such that the movement from the demand curve from D to D2 is exactly matched by the movement in the supply curve from SS to SS2, and the consequence there is that the pound is unchanged in value. That is a managed exchange rate, and the managed exchange rate, what you're doing here is you are using your reserves account to moderate the fluctuations in your currency. In this particular case, you're using the reserves account to keep your exchange rate entirely unchanged. It is important to recognize that if you're doing that, then your reserves account is being depleted, because what we're doing here is we're drawing down on our reserves account by an amount QS1 to QS2. That is the reduction in reserves which is required in order to maintain an exchange rate fixed at E1. If we turn to some examples in the world on this one, the purpose of this diagram is to illustrate the point that was being made theoretically in the previous diagram, which is how countries can manage their exchange rate. We're looking here at Russia and the Russian ruble. And you'll notice if you look at the little oval in this diagram here, this is around the time of the annexation of Crimea. And you can see also that the value of the ruble relatively constant over that period. Yet, if you look at what's happening with the reserves account in Russia, you can see just how the reserves are being run down. In other words, what's happening is the running down of the reserves is defending the ruble. So what it means is that if the reserves had not been run down, then this exchange rate, which is relatively unchanged in the small oval that we're looking at here, would actually have been a depreciation as we see in the next period here. So the Central Bank of Russia was managing the exchange rate. It was defending the ruble by running down reserves and maintaining the value of the currency. You'll notice then in the latter period where the next of the small ovals has appeared that in this case here you've got an appreciation of the ruble, and at the same time where the little oval has appeared here in the reserves account is that the reserves are building up. So the conclusion that one draws, the mechanical relationship, is that the ruble was appreciating and reserves were being built up. And if the reserves had not been built up, the ruble appreciation would have been greater. There's no conclusion one draws here from a policy perspective. It's not, one simply doesn't know without some further research whether this was a decision on the part of the Central Bank of Russia to actually prevent the appreciation of the ruble, because if the reserves had not been built up, the appreciation would have been greater. Or alternatively, if the Central Bank of Russia had simply taken the opportunity within the context of a currency appreciation to build up its reserves. So we're not making any comment on the reason for it. It simply is the currency was appreciating and reserves were being built up. If the reserves had not been built up, the appreciation would have been greater. Exchange rates. which is a variation on a theme of flexible exchange rates, but this is where a central bank chooses to fix its exchange rate for a period of time, or if it can, in perpetuity. So the Bank of England chooses to fix the exchange rate at E1. This works fine so long as the pound fluctuates around E1. So for example, imagine that you've got an increase in demand for dollars. The way that the Bank of England would cope with that, it will run down reserves to strengthen the currency, as you saw with the Boeing example a moment ago. And if it runs down that, it can fix it at that particular point. So it can fix it at E1 by running down reserves. If, on the other hand, if there is a decrease in demand for foreign exchange, or there's an increase in supply, which is the same, then now the pound has become stronger. And what the Bank of England now needs to do is weaken the pound to ensure it stays at the exchange rate E1. So what it will do here is it will remove foreign exchange off the market. It will use pounds to buy dollars, and it will then take the excess foreign exchange into the reserves account, and as a consequence, it will weaken the pound. So if we look at those two situations occurring, so long as the running down of reserves here, when the pound potentially depreciates, is more or less matched with the building up of reserves over here when the pound potentially appreciates, then the Bank of England can maintain the fix. So if you have a situation where the pound is fluctuating within that band, then you run down your reserves to defend it, you build up your reserves to weaken it, and you keep on moving there, and you can keep it at that exchange rate. The challenge that happens is if the underlying exchange rate moves away from the E1 fixed exchange rate, moves away from what is called the peg. Let's use this example to illustrate that. So now we have the pound, we now have a situation where there's increased demand for foreign exchange and the pound potentially depreciates. But the Bank of England, to use the same example, uses reserves to defend the pound, and it runs down its reserves. Then we have a situation where we have an inflow of foreign exchange, and the Bank of England builds up its reserves to counter that inflow, and we then have a further outflow, and so on. You'll recognize that the running down of the reserves account is larger than the building up of the reserves account. And the first question one must ask here is, where do you look to see the difference? Well, obviously, you look in the reserves account. And if you see the reserves account running down, you know that this situation is occurring. And if it continues, if this process continues, eventually we're running down reserves here, we're building up reserves here. You can see the building up is less than the running down, and eventually the reserves are depleted. There are no more reserves. You cannot defend the pound anymore, and the Bank of England has to abandon the peg, it has to abandon the fixed exchange rate, and the currency then depreciates to some amount here. The green line is just a green line that I've drawn in here, but it depreciates, and you can no longer defend it at the peg. In fact, you have no reserves, you can no longer defend the pound at all. The purpose of this slide is to show what happens if you have a fixed exchange rate which is overvalued. So in this case here, we're looking at the Nigerian Naira, and you can see where the first bubble is opened up is we have a fixed exchange rate. And at the same time, if you look what's happening with reserves over that same period, the reserves are being run down. From a discussion we've had before, the conclusion is very obvious that the reserves are being used to defend the Naira. It's a peg which cannot be sustained, because otherwise reserves would eventually become zero. You can see how they're running down, they would tend towards zero. So the Central Bank of Nigeria is forced to unpeg the Naira, and it then you see this big depreciation and significant depreciation from about 200 to about 300. And we then have a new fixed exchange rate. As you can see, that period within the third of the bubbles is opened up. And now if you look what's happening with the reserves account, you can see now that the reserves are actually building up. So this is an interesting one, because now what you have is you've got a fixed exchange rate and reserves are building up. And the conclusion we draw is, in fact, this is now an undervalued currency, because the Central Bank of Nigeria is being forced to accumulate reserves to actually prevent the currency appreciation, to prevent a movement in this direction here. However, that all changes in the later period, as you can see with the bubbles that's opened up, because we still have that same fixed exchange rate. But if you look at the reserves account in the final bubble, in the sixth bubble in this diagram, reserves are being drawn down. So this fixed exchange rate on the right hand side of the diagram and the running down the reserves is really identical to the first one that we started with, and the running down of the reserves. And if the reserves continue to run down, what it says, the conclusion we draw is very straightforward, is that the Naira is now again overvalued. The Central Bank of Nigeria is again defending the Naira. And if that trend continues, then sooner or later, the peg will have to be pulled and the currency will depreciate against the dollar. The final currency that I want to talk about, and the one we illustrated in lectures, is the Bulgarian lev, where the Bulgarian lev is fixed against the euro, and you can see that fixing against the euro, and it's a complete fix across the whole period here. And you can see what's happening with the reserves account in Bulgaria. You can see how the reserves are building up and building up and building up. Okay, some small running down over here. And the conclusion we draw from this is fairly straightforward, that the fixed exchange rate probably is an undervalued exchange rate, and that in order to maintain that exchange rate, the Central Bank of Bulgaria is being forced to accumulate reserves. This in itself is the reason for this. Apologies, let me say that again. The reason for this is Bulgaria wishes to enter into the Eurozone at some stage. In order to do that, there needs to be conversion between the lev and the euro. So the Central Bank of Bulgaria is fixing the lev against the euro, and in that process has to actually build up reserves to maintain that fix. So there is a technical reason for the particular fix, and the building up the reserves is part of that technical reason. We now want to look at a variation on a fixed exchange rate, which is where we choose to have an exchange rate where it's undervalued. In the real world, an example of this historically was China, where China did choose to have the yuan at an undervalued exchange rate. If we do the same thing for the pound, which is what we're doing in this particular diagram, we're now going to fix the pound not at E1, which is at its market fix. Rather, we're going to fix the pound at E2, where the fix that we're choosing, the peg that we're choosing, is an undervalued peg. The reason you're doing it, of course, is to make your exports more competitive. So if we have a situation where we're fixing at E2, the amount of dollars being supplied is here at QS supplied. We're selling more exports because our currency is artificially weak. As a result of that, there's a more than proportionate increase in the supply of dollars, and there's this amount of dollars supplied than would be the case if the currency had been at E1, where QS1 would have been supplied. Similarly, if we look at the quantity of dollars which are demanded, well, my currency is undervalued, which means that goods coming into my country, goods coming into the UK, cost more than they would do otherwise. Therefore, there's a less than proportionate amount of foreign exchange demanded by people in the UK, and that's the quantity demanded. And you have a foreign exchange surplus. So that's the surplus amount of dollars that are coming into the country. If you did nothing, that dollar surplus would result in the pound appreciating, because there's more dollars than are needed, the pound would get stronger. The action that's required is to take these dollars into reserves. So if you do want to run an exchange rate which is fixed and undervalued, the only way you can do it is to take the surplus that's being generated because you've deliberately undervalued your currency and take that surplus into your reserves account. We can now take what we've done theoretically and see this in operation in China, where the example I was using a moment ago is that China had a currency which was fixed against the US dollar and in the latter period here was in fact undervalued. The reason I know that is if I look at the reserves account in China, you can see how this reserve account, how the reserves build up and build up and build up and build up. Now, if you look at the two periods we have here, you can see that what you've got here is you've got the yuan is fixed and then the yuan begins to appreciate. At the same time, the reserves are built up and built up and built up. The conclusion we draw is that if these reserves had not been built up, this appreciation that you're seeing here, the appreciation 8 yuan to the dollar, 7 yuan, 6 yuan to the dollar, this appreciation that you're seeing here would actually have been greater. So we would have had an appreciation of the Chinese currency where the laser pointer is, rather than as we actually have it in this diagram here. So what you have is you have the People's Bank of China deliberately preventing this appreciation, a further appreciation of the yuan, by actually taking foreign exchange into reserves. Then the yuan begins to depreciate. So if you look at this drop over here, you can see that the currency is depreciating. And if you look what's going on in the reserves account, the People's Bank of China is drawing down on the reserves account. What are they doing? They're defending the yuan. So here we see a depreciation of the yuan. Here we see a defending of the yuan. The conclusion one must draw from this is that in this period here, the yuan was undervalued. And that was because the People's Bank was taking more and more forex into reserve, and the yuan actually should have been somewhere in that range over there where the laser pointer is. Clearly, that is now history, because you've got this currency depreciation here, and the People's Bank is actually drawing down on its reserves in an attempt to defend the yuan. The second of the approaches to understanding exchange rates is called the monetary approach to the balance of payments. And you'll recall from our earlier discussion that the monetary approach to the balance of payments attempts to understand exchange rate movements over the long term, 3, 5, 10 years. It is based on an assumption of purchasing power parity, and we'll come back to that. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a monetary approach in a closed economy, an economy that doesn't trade with anybody, any other country. And then we're going to look at a monetary approach in an open economy, which is an economy that trades worldwide. And what this does for us, it leads to an understanding of the real exchange rate. Let's start off with the monetary approach in a closed economy. This is a fairly easy one. And where we can go to is a much nicer place, some wonderful island in the middle of a warm area. Now, you'll notice immediately that this island has become a paradise on earth because the bank has gone. On the island, the currency which is used is the cowrie shell. And the only thing that's purchased, and there happens to be 100 cowrie shells on the island. The only thing that people use the cowrie shell for is to buy horses, because everything else is free. There happens to be 100 horses in the island. Clearly, the price of a horse, 1 cowrie shell. Then, if you look across the horizon, you'll spot the boat. And this boat is skippered by a poor, burnt-out MBA graduate, as usual. And in the bottom of the boat, we find an additional 100 cowrie shells. And the graduate goes off on the island, takes the 100 cowrie shells, buys horses, and does what people who like horses do, gallops around the island. In the process, of course, what the graduate has done is double the money supply on the island. So we now have 200 cowrie shells. And the consequence, of course, is that one horse now costs you 2 cowrie shells. And that is the quantity theory of money, which is what we started with in lecture 1 of this course. So the amount of money in circulation multiplied by its velocity is equal to the price level multiplied by the quantity, and the quantity is unchanged. So we have still 100 horses, they haven't changed. We've had more money coming into circulation, and the thing that takes up the heat is the price level. Sadly to tell you that this is mostly all wrong. In order to understand what is wrong with the previous diagram, we now want to have a look at what happens to prices in an open economy. And there are very few countries in the world that are in fact closed economies. Most countries, to a larger or lesser extent, are open economies. So let's again introduce our island. So we have this beautiful island which is nice and warm. But right next door to the island is a very large piece of land called the rest of the world. I want to stay with horses because horses are easy to draw. So we have horses on the island that are traded. We have horses in the rest of the world that are traded. But I need a two-good world. I want to have hats as my second good. If you're following on... Now, one of the challenges I've got, as usual with a recorded PowerPoint, is I can't use the hyperlinks. So ideally, I need to move between this slide and the next slide and back and forward to make this example work. I can't do it. When you use the PowerPoint without narration, there is a hyperlink on the hat. And this hyperlink on the hat allows you to jump to the next slide. Unfortunately, I can't do it. But we're going to preempt the next slide, so I'm simply going to talk to the next slide. I need some exchange rates. So the currency used in the rest of the world is the euro. The island happens to be the UK. So the currency I'm going to use on the island here is the pound. And I want to start off with some very simple exchange rates, that 1 pound is equal to 1 euro, that the price of horses equal to 1 pound is equal to 1 euro, and the price of hats is equal to 1 pound is equal to 1 euro. On the island is a central bank, and the governor of the central bank is really into horses. So the governor of the central bank prints lots of money and doubles the money supply on the island and buys horses. The question is, what happens to the price of horses in the island? And the answer is nothing, because if you look very closely at the diagram, you'll spot the bridge. And just across the bridge is a very large building called a horse trading store. So if the price of horses on the island goes from 1 pound to 1 pound and 1 pence, the governor of the Bank of England can simply cross the bridge, go to the horse trading store, and buy a horse for 1 euro, which is, of course, is 1 pound. So nothing can happen to the price of horses in the island. But bear in mind, what the governor is doing is taking pounds to cross the bridge to go to the horse trading store, but horses at the horse trading store are traded in euros. So what the governor needs to do is to exchange the pound for euros to buy a horse at the horse trading store. That process causes the pound to depreciate. Now, in the next slide, we're going to go for an extreme depreciation. So it now costs you 2 pounds to buy 1 euro to buy a horse at the horse trading store. Because it's costing you 2 pounds to buy a horse at the horse trading store, and there's still 1 euro, it's costing you 2 pounds to buy a horse on the island. I'd like to now introduce to you the happy hat maker. You can see the hat maker is a really happy looking person. And the hat maker is selling hats for 1 pound. The question is, and remember that 1 pound hats here are 1 euro. So very rapidly what the hat maker will do is take hats that are being made on the island for 1 pound, go across the bridge to the horse trading store and sell the hats for 1 euro, which of course is 2 pounds. So very rapidly the hats also cost 2 pounds. What we've done now is fairly simple at the one level, that horses are imports. So when your currency loses value, imports cost you more. And I think we all knew that. But what we're also doing now is to recognize that hats are exports. So when the currency loses value, not only do imports cost you more, but locally produced goods for the export market also cost you more. Hats cost more because I can sell my hats here for £1. I can sell my hats at the horse trading store for €1, which is £2. I'm going to sell the hats on the island for £2. Finally, so what we have here, these are tradable. So horses are tradable, a hat is a tradable, you can make them, you can sell them. I now want to introduce a non-tradable, the hairdresser. The hairdresser cuts hair. It's a non-tradable. And we find the price of haircuts are going up. Well, the reason that haircuts are going up in price is because the hairdresser looks at the hat maker. The hat maker looks really cool and really wealthy. Look at the beautiful hat the hat maker's got, really wealthy. And the consequence is that the hairdresser stops cutting hair and starts making hats. This results in a decrease of hairdressers and a resultant increase in the price of haircuts. So what we've had is we've had a currency depreciation which causes the price of imports to increase, causes the price of domestically produced goods for the export market to increase, but also causes the price of non-tradables to increase. The currency depreciation results in an overall increase in the price level on the island. So this slide repeats what happened on the island, and it's repetition because I can't use the hyperlinks. So we have the island, which is the UK, we have the rest of the world, which is Europe, we have the exchange rate as we started with, €1 is equal to $1. We've got the price of horses, €1 is equal to $1, and we have the price of hats equal to €1 to $1. And there's a hyperlink, as you can see again on the hats here, which takes you back to the previous diagram if you're working in the PowerPoint without narration. So when the Bank of England prints money and goes across the bridge to buy horses, the initial consequence of that is that the pound loses value because I'm exchanging pounds for euros, and we now end up in a situation where it's £2 to €1. That has the consequence of pushing up the price of horses from £2 to €1 because I need to have £2 to buy €1 to buy one horse. It also pushes up the price of hats because the hat maker can sell the hats on the island for £1. They can sell them in the rest of the world for €1. And the consequence that if you can do that, you need £2 on the island to buy one hat, which could be sold in the rest of the world as €1. That's an export. The price of haircuts, as we saw a moment ago, is a non-tradable, and the price also goes up as a result of that. So to begin to formalize this a little bit more carefully, if we look at the process by which a currency depreciation causes price increases, the first thing you have is a currency depreciation. The second thing you have is import prices go up. The third thing you have happening is that the price of homogeneous exports goes up, coal, oil, things of that nature. Then you have the price of non-homogeneous exports going up. We'll come back to that. Then you have the price of non-traditional exports going up. For example, if the pound loses value, antique furniture is actually worth more in Europe than it is in London. So enterprising people will sell their furniture into Europe. It will decrease the supply of furniture in London, and it will push up the price of furniture in London. And finally, we get a price of the non-tradables increasing as well. What we want to focus on just in the next part of the discussion are these two. So it's obvious why the price of homogeneous exports increases in value. It's not always clear, and it doesn't necessarily follow that the price of non-homogeneous exports will go up in price. So if we introduce the next slide to explore that, and we look at export prices, let's start with an exchange rate of £1 to $1. And we start with oil as a homogeneous export, and the barrel price of oil $10. At the exchange rate of £1 to $1, and Britain is an oil exporter, obviously the price of oil, which is $10, is £10. If the pound were to depreciate to £2 to the dollar, then the price of oil in pounds goes up to $20. You're the proud owner of a British oil rig. You can sell your oil at $10 in the rest of the world or £10 in Britain. When the pound depreciates, you can sell your oil at $10 in the rest of the world or £20 in Britain. You clearly wouldn't continue to charge £10 in Britain because there are profits to be made. So a currency depreciation, because I can sell my oil anywhere in the world at $10, with a pound currency depreciation, I'm no longer going to charge £10 for my oil, I'm going to charge £20. The same is not necessarily true for a non-homogeneous export. So if we do the same thing, run the same example again, if we have a car price that's produced in the UK, so this is a UK manufactured car of £1,000, and we have the green exchange rate £1 to $1, clearly you're exporting your car at £1,000. If the pound now depreciates to £2 to the dollar, you have a choice. You can export your car at £1,000. You can keep that the pound price constant, which gives you a dollar price of 500, and potentially makes you more competitive in the US market. Or you can keep your dollar price constant and charge £2,000 in the UK. At this point in our conversation, this is a strategic decision at the level of a firm. In a short while, you'll see that in fact the firm has no choice but to do this. That we'll leave that for a moment. So now we come on to a very widely held notion, and if you read the title, the widely held notion is that a currency depreciation improves the competitiveness of a country's international trade. It does this by making exports more competitive because it makes exports cheaper in foreign currency terms and therefore boosts exports. It increases the price of imports. It makes imports less competitive and therefore reduces imports. And the currency depreciation therefore boosts the economy. More imports, less exports, that's a boost for the economy. That's the commonly held view. Unfortunately, it's mostly all wrong. And it only occurs under very specific conditions. Generally, it's not correct. In order to understand this, we have to introduce a concept called the real exchange rate. In order to understand the problems we've got with the commonly held view between a currency depreciation and its impact on the competitiveness and growth of an economy, we need to start off by first of all doing something we haven't done before, and that's to define an exchange rate. And an exchange rate is defined as the price, in this case in the UK, divided by the price of its trading partners. So for example, at the time that this particular recording was made, one could buy an external hard drive for about €90 in Rotterdam and about £72 in the UK. At the time of that this was recorded, the exchange rate between the pound and the euro was £1 to 1.26 euros. If I take my 90 and my 72 and I divide them, I end up with 1.25. So you can see that the ratio of prices is very similar, 1.26, 1.25. There's really nothing in it. So the exchange rate is the ratio of prices. Now, to begin to understand why there are problems with the commonly held notion, let's again take this exchange rate definition and let's use it to begin to understand the problem. So we start off with E is equal to prices in UK divided by price of trading partners, and we have a currency depreciation. So the pound loses 10%, and that's the first thing that happens. And clearly, at the moment it happens, UK exports are more competitive. Tourism in the UK, for example, is 10% cheaper. UK tourism is 10% more competitive. But shortly after that, the consequence of the currency depreciation in the UK is that imports cost more in the UK. So oil costs more, clothing costs more, imported food costs more, imported wine costs more, and so on. So too does the price of goods produced in the UK for the export market, and so too, after a long lag, do the price of non-tradables. So what you have is you have a currency depreciation of 10%, resulting in a price increase of 10%, and that makes your exports 10% less competitive. So what we're seeing now is that the commonly held notion that a currency depreciation is good for exports is only taking into account this part of the equation, that the pound loses value. Yes, exports are more competitive by 10%. It's not factoring in that the currency depreciation results in price increases, and those price increases in turn, because they push up the price structure of the export market, they in turn outweigh any of the 10% gain that you had, and your exports are 10% less competitive. If 1 is equal to 2, then the 10 obviously equal to the 10, and you're right back to where you started. The only place that this kind of change can occur and make you more competitive is if you have a 10% depreciation of the currency and you only have a resultant price increase of 5%. And the question is, how is this possible? How can it happen? Well, the only way it can happen is that if people in the UK are willing to take a 5% wage cut, are willing to take a 5% cut in profits. Because what you've got is you've got a 10% currency depreciation, which is pushing up all prices by 10%. The only thing that can take the heat is labor and capital. So if you're going to have that 5% increase, the only thing that can take that heat is wages and profit. Which brings us on finally to the real exchange rate. And what the real exchange rate does is it takes the nominal exchange rate changes and the resultant inflation and puts them together in the same formula. So now we have the real exchange rate is equal to the nominal exchange rate multiplied by the inverse of the price ratios. So now what we have is we have the nominal exchange rate and the resultant price increases in the UK in the same formula. So now if we use the formula and we follow the same logic that we had before in the previous slide, we have a currency depreciation, nominal depreciation. That's the first thing that happens. And that makes UK exports more competitive. So you also have a resultant real exchange rate depreciation. So these things happen simultaneously. And number one, which causes a nominal depreciation, makes UK exports more competitive. And that's a depreciation in the real exchange rate, number two. But number one also causes price increases in the UK, which clearly makes the UK less competitive. And if 1 is equal to 3, then what you're going to get is you're going to get an appreciation of the real exchange rate. So if 1 is equal to 3, if 1 is 10% and 3 is 10%, then 2 is 10% and 4 is 10%, which means you started off with a currency depreciation number 1, which results in a real depreciation, number 2. But the currency depreciation results in high inflation, number 3, which erodes your competitiveness and causes a appreciation of the real exchange rate. Let's have a look at this in practice. This happens to be South Africa, but it's not important. And the first thing one wants to see is this is the nominal exchange rate. So the blue line is your nominal exchange rate. The red line is the real exchange rate. And just notice, first of all, before we look at the formula, just how the real exchange rate is little unchanged right across this entire period. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to use what's called an inverted scale. So where we have a depreciation and E becomes bigger, in this particular case, E becomes smaller. So we're inverting the formula because that's the nature of this particular diagram. So let's do it. So now we have a currency depreciation. Okay, it's an inverted scale. So in the previous one, E became bigger. In this case, E is becoming smaller merely because of the inverted scale. So there's a currency depreciation here, which you can see there's my currency depreciation. The rand is weaker. The consequence of the currency depreciation is it causes a depreciation in the real exchange rate, again the inverted scale issue. And there you can see the depreciation in the real exchange rate, and that makes South African exports more competitive. But this nominal depreciation pushes up the price level, which you can't see in this diagram, but the price level increased. And the consequence of the price increase is it caused the real exchange rate to appreciate, number 4, and there you can see the appreciation of the real exchange rate. So to repeat it, what you've got is you've got a nominal depreciation, number 1, causing a real depreciation, number 2, and exports are more competitive. But the nominal depreciation results in higher inflation, number 3, which you can't see in this diagram, but it occurred, which makes exports less competitive and results in an appreciation of the real exchange rate, number 4, and there's number 4. And if you look what's happened to the real exchange rate over this period here, the answer is virtually nothing. That it started at an index of 100 and it ends up back at an index of 100. What the previous 2 diagrams have shown is the very powerful logic of the real exchange rate. We now want to just begin to question that logic by running a derivation of the real exchange rate. So we start with the nominal exchange rate in order to get from nominal to real. In order to move towards the real exchange rate, we multiply the nominal rate by the inverse of the price ratios. On the right-hand side of the equation, the UK, PUKs cancel, the P stars cancel, and you end up with a situation which is inviolate. In other words, the real exchange rate, which is this formulation here from the previous slide, is equal to 1. And clearly the question is, what does 1 mean? Well, 1 means that the equation is inviolate, meaning it cannot change, meaning that this ratio here is always fixed, it's always 1. That's mathematically. You'll recall how we started this part of the discussion is that one of the things that underlies the monetary approach to the balance of payments is the assumption of purchasing power parity. So to begin to understand what this all means, let's have a look at the notion of purchasing power parity. And purchasing power parity defined, as you can see, is that price levels in different countries adjusted by the exchange rate will be similar. It's effectively the law of one price, which is easier to define, that the law of one price is that similar goods in similar markets will have similar prices. Now, there's some obvious differences. There's got to be obvious differences between prices in different countries. but they are fairly easily explained. So for instance, there are transport costs. If you look at the cost of producing, at the cost of buying something in the home market, where that has got to be transported to the export market, clearly there are transport costs. There are import duties that have got to be done. There may be lack of competition. There may be a marketing strategy. For example, Levi jeans may be cheaper in one country than another country, deliberately on the part of Levi. There may be issues with non-tradables, and there may just be data problems. But the notion of purchasing power parity has a very powerful logic. Come back to the hard drive that we started this conversation with. If a hard drive in London cost twice the amount that a hard drive cost in Rotterdam, what would you do? Well, the answer is very simple. You would buy up all the hard drives in Rotterdam, you'd put them into a container, you'd ship them to London. The consequence would be that the price of hard drives in Rotterdam would increase because there's been an increased demand. The price of hard drives in London would decline because there's been an increase in supply, and the prices have to equalize, and that process has to continue until the prices equalize. So irrespective of all of these potential problems with the law of one price, it has a very powerful logic. And this is what underlies the monetary approach to the balance of payments. But it's also what underlies the fact that the monetary approach to the balance of payments looks over the long term, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Because over the long term, the law of one price is inviolate. Prices in different countries have to eventually equalize. Again, given for these differences that we're looking at here. Having said that, let's look at some of the potential differences. What this slide is showing you are some differences in prices between two cities which are very close together, Rotterdam and Manchester. And logic would suggest that these prices there should not be these kind of differences in prices. So for example, in Rotterdam, the price of an inexpensive restaurant is about 15 euros. Equivalent in Manchester is about 12 euros. So in Rotterdam, eating in a restaurant is nearly 20% more expensive than in Manchester. Yet if you go for a mid-range restaurant, Rotterdam is cheaper. If you eat at McDonald's, it's more expensive in Rotterdam, which is a good thing. That's a value judgment, and so on. Now, some of the things which are really way out of line here are things like Coke and Pepsi, where in Rotterdam they are nearly 62% more than they are in Manchester. And Rotterdam, where there's quite a lot of water, we find that bottled water is in fact, again, very close to 60% more. If we come to some things which are closer to being tradables, where the previous diagram were some things which are more non-homogeneous, you'll again see that the prices now tend to converge a little bit in the earlier period here. We get to cheese, and cheese in Rotterdam is twice the price of cheese in Manchester. Yes, I know as Dutch, you're very proud of your cheese and you think your cheese is better, but it cannot be worth twice the price. And then we get these additional prices here. So clearly, prices in Rotterdam for all of these things here have to be less than in Manchester, simply because you have to have that to be able to afford cheese. And then we do the same thing here. The point of the last three slides is to show you that the logic of purchasing power parity, the logic of the law of one price, is a very powerful logic. Yet what we're seeing between two cities which are fairly close together geographically, we're seeing quite large disparities in prices. It may be a quality issue, it may be a strategy issue. If you look, for instance, at these shoes, it may be a quality issue, it may be a strategy issue. The law of one price has very powerful logic, yet reality is suggesting that maybe that logic somehow is flawed. And over the long term, given if we distract from transport prices and strategies and things of that nature, these prices have to converge. This diagram illustrates real exchange rates in Europe, and what is interesting about this diagram is with some of the countries we're looking at in Europe, we're looking at countries within the Eurozone. So what that means is that the exchange rate within those countries is fixed, and the only thing that causes any real exchange rate difference is, of course, what's happening with the inflation rate in that country. So this makes for a very interesting comparison. The way this is the most recent data which is available, as you can see, and the way that you understand the diagram is that as the number becomes larger, the country becomes increasingly less competitive. So if we start with the light yellow for those countries which are highly competitive, you can see that some of the Scandinavian countries are highly competitive. I know they're not in the Eurozone, but they are highly competitive within the context of Europe. And Ireland is also highly competitive here. And of course, we have that over here as well. Within the Eurozone, which is the interesting part of this, again, I repeat myself because the exchange rate is fixed. Here, what we're seeing is Portugal, France, Italy, and others over here as being highly competitive within the Eurozone, and that's because prices are down. So Italy has been forced to become more competitive. Greece has been forced to become more competitive, but other countries like Spain, the UK, the so-called low countries, Germany, these countries are all less competitive than they were before. So this makes for a very interesting comparison. One of the reasons for this increased competitiveness, at least within the Eurozone, is of course the result of austerity. There was major austerity in Ireland, in Portugal, in Italy, and in Greece within the Eurozone. Even France has taken on a bit of the austerity, but there's other ones which are also interesting, and that is Spain, where there was austerity, but it's not as competitive as it could be. And of course, the UK, in its current political dilemma, is really not competitive and is really not positioned to take on the might of the world should it wish to do what it tends to do. And on that point, that's the end of the section. Thank you for having the patience to go through it.